Welcome to the Trend Detection Podcast, powered by Siemens. And now your host, Niall Sullivan.
So welcome to this second episode in our Trend Detection series, all around industry highlights and predictive maintenance. Once again, I'm joined by my colleague, Alex Hill, Global Head of Business Development for Senseye Predictive Maintenance.
Thanks for having me back, Niall.
That's great. So today we're going to focus on another industry, food and beverage, which I know is another one very close to our heart. We've got some great sort of use cases there as well. So I'm really excited to dive into that topic. But again, let's sort of focus and take a step back and look at the challenges facing this industry today, and what are the main challenges in food and beverage from your point of view?
Food and beverage is one of our industries that I feel is separate from the others. A lot of them you can categorize in a similar way, and they have similar problems, and often that problem starts with unplanned downtime. Food and beverage is less like that because they don't have serialized production so much. They often have a lot of parallel production. They have many machines in an area that can essentially do the same thing. And so we used to come along and say, hey, we're going to save you all this unplanned downtime. And people would say, well, we don't really have any, so we don't need you. And actually, we had to then shift what we're talking about. And it's become more about quality and consistency and sustainability, and making sure that when they have their maintenance window, because they might be operating for 16 days or something, just all the time, just crank out as much product as you can. When they need to maintain it, then they can get that done and they know where to focus. And when they need to run, they know it's going to work. It's not going to fall apart. They're not going to miss some form of production or delivery window. So food and beverage does have its own issues, and you're often then dealing with perishable goods. So you need to make sure that when you're performing this run and it's all queued up, it's going to be reliable, it's going to work well, and that you're not spending too much on maintenance. That's probably one of the biggest areas that we see, maintenance efficiency. There's always this saying that over-maintenance is cheaper than failure, and it's absolutely true, but it's still really expensive. And we've had some cases where one site will be producing the same product as another, but spending 10 times the amount on maintenance. And yeah, they don't have any failures, but clearly there's an opportunity to reduce their maintenance spend by 10 times. But how? And that's how Senseye Predictive Maintenance can help. We can allow people to say, okay, well, maybe I don't need to maintain this so much because there's not as much evidence, or there's no evidence that I need to go and do this as much as I need. There's no degradation seen on the machine. I can comfortably say that I'm not going to perform this planned maintenance. I can save the labor, save the spare parts, save the consumables in repairing that machine, and go and focus on something else that actually matters, that really needs it, and save that money.
And that's it, and that's interesting. That and you're completely right. We're not focused on unplanned downtime, but does that make it harder to when we're talking to customers to actually pinpoint where we can make efficiencies? Because, like I said, if you're saving this much unplanned downtime, that's this many hours, this many savings. Is it harder to quantify that?
I wouldn't say so, but there's no general answer to every customer. Every customer is different in terms of, I'm going to walk that back. Every customer wants some form of business outcome, but how they achieve that is different. What their particular KPIs and how they then translate that to a dollar, euro, pound, whatever value, that's slightly different and nuanced. And when we started, we used to think that everybody is exactly the same. We can take the same approach, talk about the same things like unplanned downtime. And you see a lot of people in the market now still talking only about unplanned downtime. And I think that's a rather poorly sophisticated approach. It's very unsophisticated. The fact is that with every deployment, we needed to sit down and understand from customers, how are they monitoring these KPIs? What matters to them? How do they then translate that to a business outcome? And that's why we developed the Senseye knowledge platform and the methodology around that, so that we had the tools to share with customers and to sit down together and say, what are we actually trying to achieve here? Because it's not an innovation project. We've proven that predictive maintenance works. We don't need to be innovating this concept. This is not a wild concept that no one has tried now. We have plenty of case studies about it. What we need to do is sit down and figure out how this is going to make your job easier, and how that's going to matter to the overall business, and how you can show that, so that we can establish that mapping from something weird happened on a machine to this is the business outcome. This is why we're doing it. This is why it matters. And unplanned downtime is a factor in food and beverage, but it's less so than quality or just maintenance spend, maintenance efficiency. and how do we make sure that we bump that up as much as possible.
So I guess what you're saying, not to focus on sort of competitors too much, but it's that maybe their focus is more on downtime. So I guess that's where they see the dollar signs in their eyes of where they can make a big impact. But I guess it's about, and through, I guess we could maybe talk about the sort of that value workshop, the sort of the very early stages where we're actually focusing on the outcomes, which again is something, in a marketing perspective, we focus on the most. So what actually happens in that value workshop to identify?
So when someone talks about unplanned downtime and that's all they focus on, to me that means they just don't have much experience. They haven't actually done much of this, and they've experimented with putting some algorithms together and they've got some interesting results, and that's cool. The fact is, predictive maintenance, everybody can do it, and there are algorithms out there. There are things that you can get. You can bring in loads of data. You can see some cool stuff on 5 machines, 10 machines, maybe even 50 machines. But then to scale that out to a whole enterprise, the technology and the level of sophistication and experience you need is on a completely different level. And there aren't many companies in the world that can do that. And spoiler, we're one of them. But that scope workshop, that sitting down, it's part of that whole software as a service. So it's not just a product that we can put in people's hands and magic happens. I wish it was. And we took that approach for quite a long time, and it didn't get us to where we wanted. We had failed projects. I'd love to say we never had any, but we did, because we didn't understand that part of predictive maintenance, or we didn't fully appreciate that part of what makes predictive maintenance work is culture and change. And so in those initial value and scoping workshops, you need to get everybody sat down, everybody from maintenance, data analytics, if the customer has anybody on that side, people who are going to be wielding spanners, IT, the VPs who are going to be saying, this is why I spent this money. You need them sat in the same room and agreeing on a common goal and how to measure that goal. And it's going to be slightly different for each organization, but you need them sat down and saying, okay, well, this is how we can trace everything happening from I go and do a job on a machine to this has helped me do X, and now I can show Y as an improvement. And we sit down and we work them through that. We have various calculations. We can say, okay, this is what we believe is standard for your industry. And often it might be wrong, and that's good. It gets a conversation going. And people start sharing their problems and their issues, and we can say, okay, we can now map that into something that we can capture within the application. We can start to automate this. We can make it really a smooth workflow. People hate change. But if we can show them that we're going to help you to do your job in a more efficient way, and you're still going to be the hero, and you're still going to have your name recorded against this thing, and you've saved this big failure, and you save all this money, then you get people bought into it and excited about it. Nice. But a lot of this is, what I want to emphasize is 50% of predictive maintenance is not technology.
Yeah, it's a cultural shift.
It's a cultural shift. It's change. People don't like change, so we have to make it as easy as possible.
Exactly. And I think in our previous episode we talked about the sort of the journey from our automotive customer. We were talking about how their journey and how maybe even 8 years ago they might have been ahead of their time. But has food and beverage sort of gone on a similar journey in terms of adoption of Industry 4.0 and predictive maintenance tools? Is it something that's becoming more at the forefront of their mind, and not just, like you point out, innovation project? It's something this is actually a serious business tool which can deliver serious business outcomes.
Food and beverage is an interesting one because we dismissed it for at least the first couple of years, and they just didn't have the technology that we needed. They didn't have any automation. They still had a lot of people, and there still are a lot of people manually mixing up recipes and batches and pouring it into something, and then it goes to another machine and goes to conveyor and things. But the level of automation that they had compared to automotive was very unsophisticated, and they've actually skipped a lot of the work. People talk about industry 1, 2, 3, 4 in terms of the level of machine connectivity and the level of data shared and things, and food and beverage just didn't have a lot of that until now. And they've suddenly started to invest more and more in making sure that they can view their processes and make sure that things are consistent from a global level as well as that factory level. And that means you need quite a large investment in digital acceleration. And they've spun up entire departments to make this happen. And they're doing it quite well. We used to think that food and beverage, they often sell or trade factories. You might have one brand being made in one factory by one of the large conglomerates, and then another conglomerate making it in another area, or producing things under license. But with the shareability of data becoming more common, and with people wanting to have some more unified business tools, then they need ways to monitor that. They need ways to integrate those things. And we're starting to see that actually, in many ways, they are overtaking other customers in other sectors because they've not had all of this legacy information and infrastructure. They're investing in new technologies. They're going cloud first, and that's becoming really, really interesting. So they are rapidly overtaking other sectors.
I think I was going to just take from that as well. You were talking about a more global approach, because I think we say a lot of the time it's very siloed, let's say, in terms of a plant will use different tools, different systems. But from what you're saying is maybe food and beverage are actually looking at the bigger picture and thinking more the bigger picture. We need global solutions, not just our individual solutions.
Yeah, and actually that comes into one of the main payback areas of predictive maintenance. If you look at the efficiencies that we're able to make, and we go back to automotive, one of our first projects was to help a customer reduce unplanned downtime by 50%. And we did that. And that's a huge amount. But how did that actually affect their overall metrics, their overall equipment, overall operational effectiveness? It moved that figure by about 1%. And that 1% means millions and millions of pounds for that customer. But in order to see that kind of translation of a very small percentage point translating into millions, your production volume needs to be huge because your margins are so small. Mm. And food and beverage is actually quite similar in that way, where the margins are even smaller. The product is inherently very low value. So if you're looking at just a particular area in this plant, maybe we're looking at packaging or maybe we're just looking at mixing, the argument to implement predictive maintenance on that is actually not very good. In terms of unplanned downtime, you probably don't have much. In terms of quality and consistency and things, that's good, but difficult to measure, difficult to move that needle and translate that to a big win. Because everybody wants big wins. Everybody wants an ROI in less than 12 months. That's typically what we try to achieve. But in order to do that, you've got to go large. You've got to go to at least plant and region or global scale. And that's when those very small improvements start to then translate into millions and millions of pounds, dollars. And that starts to get really exciting. And you can only do that with a technology that is really scalable, really easy to use. You can't have a technology and a system that requires lots of manual intervention, lots of people building and maintaining models. So food and beverage, we see the larger organizations understanding that their margins are small, their product is very low value. So you've got to do this on a global level at scale in order to move that needle in a way that you want to see.
And I guess along those lines as well, in terms of that global scale, does Senseye sort of adjust, or Senseye Predictive Maintenance adjust its approach depending on, obviously it's very diverse, because what you need for ice creams is completely different to what you need for pet food. There's two very random examples. Does Senseye sort of adjust its approach based on those kind of nuances, those differences?
The technology itself, no. The technology is the same whether you're making chocolate bars or pet food or cars. It's the same application, the same technology behind the scenes. But the algorithms will adapt themselves depending on the kind of data that we're seeing. So if we have, for example, in one area where we have very high quality vibration data, then the output and the algorithms and the behavior of the application is quite different to if we're only seeing timing and torque measurements. And in terms of what people get out of that, it depends what they really need. But fundamentally, we're trying to direct human attention to where it's most needed, and the technology or the data that feeds that, you need to make it sure it's appropriate. Do we need to go and put vibration monitoring on everything? No. Particularly in food and beverage where the margins are very low and maybe they're swapping out machines quite often, it's just not worth it. But the way that we might approach on a site level how they start to translate that into a business outcome, that might differ depending on what kind of product they're making. And we do see in different areas where, for example, in pet food, it might be the packaging and the mixing that's more critical. In ice cream manufacturing, then it would be things like the chillers. Then we've got to focus on those, and those are much more sensitive, and you might need much better data for those. So there are nuances in terms of how we approach things from a deployment and an integration point of view. From a technology point of view, it's the same. And that allows us to be massively scale So it allows us to be massively scalable. What I mean by that is we're not too interested in the 50 or 100 machines. That's cool. We can do a project. We can show a full business return on that. But what we're really well optimized for is the tens of thousands of machines across that entire enterprise, and making sure that everybody sees a business value to that.
And I think what you say leads back to what we're saying about the Senseye knowledge platform, that early scope phase where you're actually identifying assets and the data, and more importantly, the business outcomes that we're looking to achieve from a project as well. So it's not necessarily whether it's a chiller or a fridge or packaging line. It's about where can Senseye Predictive Maintenance make the perfect outcome.
It's exactly that. It's what does this actually matter to the business? And it reminds me, every time we start engaging with a customer, they say, okay, these are our critical assets. These are the ones we want to monitor. And we always push back on that, because typically the critical assets are very well catered to. They're already being maintained because they're critical. They're already being monitored, usually, because they're critical. And they don't really fail that much because they're critical. So we've got to look at the areas, where are you actually spending the money? Because it's probably not in your critical assets. You're already spending that. You need to spend that anyway. Let's go and look at the areas where you're going and doing your work orders that take you a couple of hours every day and are seen as more of a nuisance. But actually, you're spending a lot of money on that. Let's reduce that. And that's a really quick win that we can go for. The critical assets are typically not a quick win. We've had projects that have failed because we weren't experienced at the time. The customer said, we need to monitor these critical assets. We monitored them. Nothing happened. And then they say predictive maintenance didn't work. Well, it does, but we, short of throwing sand in your machines, we can't show you that it's working because nothing interesting is happening. Let's look at these other areas that typically wouldn't be well serviced by a very manual approach to collecting and interpreting this data, and seeing how we can reduce your spend in those areas.
So it's a kind of misconception that's just, like, mainly in the food and beverage industry, or is that spread out into
It's absolutely everywhere. There's a lot of commonality. There's more commonality between the different industries that we serve than there are differences. And the dirty little secret is that, well, it's exactly that these industries have far more in common than they think.
Yes.
Particularly when you're looking at mass or batch production, and you're looking at products that have a lower and lower margin. Consumer products typically don't have huge margins. You need to be pushing these things out as consistently as you can, as quickly as you can. And the technologies and ways you do that are actually very similar.
And again, it's what we were talking about just before we recorded this episode, actually, how bottling in a pharmaceutical environment compared to bottling, beer in a food and beverage environment, Senseye, it's the same process, the same technology powering it.
To Senseye Predictive Maintenance, it doesn't actually matter. And this is because we take a very data-driven approach, or data-centric condition monitoring, as we used to call it, but we don't because that it's difficult to explain. But to explain it is we don't care so much about the specific failure mode or even what the asset is. We care about the data coming out of it, and if that data can be used to reliably inform if that asset is degrading or not. And if it is, then we know that it deserves human attention, probably more so than an asset that isn't showing any signs of degradation. And that's our simplest currency that we can deal with. Human attention, where to go and focus, and what to do about it. With more data, we can be much more specific, we can be much more accurate in predictions and things, but fundamentally, what we care about is, does this data represent something normal or something abnormal? What can we learn from that? How can we contextualize it? And how can we show to a human that this deserves attention?
Absolutely. And I think so it's sort of coming to the end, but I wanted just to finish on, obviously we've got global deployments in this particular industry, and I think it'd be great just to finish on just some of the successes that you've seen, or we've seen from some of these global deployments. That's on the spot, isn't it?
Alex is thinking, how do I mention it without mentioning?
Yeah, that's the tricky one, isn't it?
That's a tough one.
Sorry, we can say our time here.
No matter what I say, I've got. Do you want successes in terms of we found a machine that was doing something weird, or I need to think about that actually.
That's okay. So, yeah, it's because I know we can't use the whole. I don't know. It could be about the scalability. So we're,
actually, there's one thing where
it could be just one specific case, like
there is one specific case of a pharmaceutical company where, and this is actually quite an early stage deployment, but this is a really good case where it's been proven out that the technology that we've produced, that we obsess over, that we love, is only half the story. And by that, I was on a call this morning actually, and we found out that we'd accidentally given everyone full access to our Senseye knowledge platform. And usually that's something that we charge for. And in this case, it didn't happen. There's some form of clerical error and everyone had access to it. And they loved it. They saw it. They got really enthusiastic about it. These are the maintainers, the people who are directly responsible for these, for this whole project, and they ran away with it. And they started integrating. They started putting in machines that we had no idea about, and they got it. And I think it was already very well aligned with their own internal processes and their curiosity. But it showed that we gave them the material, and it's not training on how to use Senseye Predictive Maintenance. It's material, workshops, training, reports, and processes around how you turn this into a successful business outcome. And when people could see, okay, now I can, by wielding my spanner in this way and in a more directed manner, now I can show directly that I am saving the company money and that I'm responsible for this and I've captured this win and I can communicate that effectively. Then people are really enthusiastic about showing that, okay, my job now has a much wider and more powerful meaning in the context of how we produce this product safely and consistently and at a certain cost point. So we saw people running away, getting all excited, and going way beyond what our customer success team would typically be guiding them to do at that stage. So that's really awesome from an information sharing point of view and from a story point of view that isn't just about the technology.
Yeah. I mean, what nice high point to end on, but it's really about what we were saying before. It's those things overlapping: data, technology, culture, bringing that together.
Yeah.
And I think that's because I know the customer you were referring to as well. So they're not actually been deploying Senseye for actually that long either. So I mean, it's
very new, and we've got to look at these things globally as well, because we deal with that customer. The customer management and the actual deployment, this is continents apart. But the fact that we're able to share this information and get everybody enthused about it and leverage IoT and connectivity and all of these things where people can work across the world together on a single platform and see business outcome from that, that's really good.
Fantastic. So that brings us to the end of this episode. I'd like to thank Alex again for joining me today.
Thanks again, Niall, and talk to you next time.
Yeah, fantastic.
Maybe.
Maybe. No, so that's the end of our sort of food and beverage sort of focus, and we'll be moving on to sort of heavy industry, metals and mining in our next episode. So please subscribe so you can catch that at a later date. And yes, see you on the next episode.
Please like and subscribe on all major podcast channels and find out more about Senseye Predictive Maintenance at Siemens.com.